Hello. Welcome back to the GM's Guide. I'm your host, Dan Felder, your kind and merciful GM. Now, when we last left off, we were talking to Mark, the creator of Primordia, one of my favorite adventure games of all time, and that's not an easy genre to do well. Now, when I was playing that game, I was blown away by how richly interesting the world was. I immediately wanted to set a campaign in it or something inspired by it, and also just how well presented the world was. I immediately wrote a review of it. He commented on it. I reached out to him. The whole thing is in part one. Now, I know that you are probably eagerly awaiting the second part of this interview, which is about to happen now. So, those who have not tuned into this before, go back and check out the previous episode in part one. You will not be disappointed. For the rest of us, I'm going to edit Mark to start talking exactly where he left off. So, Mark, let's get going. Please continue your glorious thought process in 3, 2, 1, build.
Well, what we are writing about in fantasy and science fiction is often extraordinarily removed from the lives that we've led. And I don't mean that we don't have robots and lightsabers and dragons.
Oh, we sure
and
do.
Right. But more like if you sort of look at like Robert E. Howard's life versus Conan's life, I mean, there's essentially no overlap whatsoever. Like Howard was sickly, lived with his mother, lived in Texas. Uh, you know, Conan is this hyper masculine rogue living in Samaria or whatever. I think we need to be thoughtful about what that implies and how we can make mistakes. And you see this sometimes, like someone will be describing some phenomenon that occurs in our world in a fantasy setting, like how far an army can march in a day, or how much metal it takes to build a cannon or something like that, and it's just incorrect. And I think one thing, you can't make yourself a true expert on the setting that you're working from. But if you look at the guys who were sort of the early Dungeons and Dragons types, I mean, I think they did spend quite a bit of time trying to understand, even just on a physics level, how these fights would take place, for example. Which is odd because Dungeons and Dragons is a very abstract combat system. Um, but where I was sort of, I guess part of where I'm going with this is that often the best that we can do is to read someone else's account of the thing that we are writing about. But that's not always going to be in genre fiction or in a game. For example, one I think significant theme, although it's not really in the front of Primordia, is the complete ecological collapse of the world that you're in. And some of that came from while I was working on the game, I was reading these very depressing sort of the world is doomed kind of ecology books. And I think one thing that is rewarding is to think about where can I look beyond the typical paths to get a little bit more here. In Primordia, I was able to draw on some of my law school stuff for some of the puzzles and some of the characters. I'm a big Shakespeare fan. You mentioned with Horatio, and so drawing on stuff like that. And then on the game I'm currently working on, Fallen Gods, a lot of what I've been doing has just been reading like Icelandic sagas and Norse mythology and things like that. But I've also read like travel guides to Scandinavian countries to get a sense for what the environment is like and things like that. And I think, and looking at photographs and so forth, and I would urge people not to neglect that side of world building, which is part of sort of getting your brain to the point where you've reprogrammed it to start spitting out more or less accurate facts about this world that you're inventing, so that it doesn't take a conscious act of will for you to come up with how does a vampire behave in a bar or whatever, but you've become so familiar with the relevant aspects of that that now your brain can just generate that on its own.
Exactly. Like you need to be able to rely on your own brain to generate ideas. So if you don't do your research, you're going to only get the genre neutral cliches because that's the only thing that has overlap in your brain. So it's going to be the most generic thing possible because the stuff that feels familiar to you is the stuff that you've seen so often and so generically that it happens regardless of genre and regardless of work. That's by definition. The stuff that is most common is what will be at the top of your head. So, and the stuff that you've, of course, seen most recently. That's the whole idea of recency bias and availability bias. But luckily, we can use recency bias to overcome availability bias by just flooding our brains with as much detail as possible about whatever thing we're working on. And that's something that is absolutely essential. And there's psychological literature documenting that this is how the brain works. So it's really, really important to do research and to get a lot of inspiration from different angles, but within the same context of what you're working on. Like whenever I'm working on a new project, I just swamp myself in anything that is thematically relevant, and that I swamp myself into the actual setting creation as well. I'll jump between the two, but that's where you really need to train your brain to create these cohesive universes. There's a great saying I like that a writer is a world trapped in a person. But like a ship in the bottle, this is my take on it, you have to get that world in somehow.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's both the quote and your take on it. I mean, the other thing I would add is, you mentioned earlier that often people are concerned about, am I just going to end up taking someone else's ideas if I read her work? And I mean, I guess the answer is yes, you probably will. But you're doing that anyway. One of the sort of terrifying things about going back and doing, you know, playing Primordia a million times and doing commentary on stuff, you realize there are like 20 things in the game that were, meant as homages to other adventure games. And then there are like 200 things in the game that weren't meant as homages that just are from other adventure games. Like, there's a part where you go into a giant robot's head by plugging its nose. And I thought that was a sort of a dumb puzzle that I came up with entirely on my own.
Was this Secret of Monkey Island?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
I knew it.
Just played it with my daughters, and I was like, oh my god, you got into a giant head by poking its ear with a Q-tip. This is clearly I was just copying that idea. And so, I mean, I think, as Ecclesiastes says, there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, that may be overstating it slightly, but I think you just have to accept that what you will be doing is 90% reassembling parts. And so, rather than being scared of taking parts, as you said, you should be enthusiastic about getting as many parts as possible in your basket, which reduces the likelihood that when you start assembling parts, you're going to create a true duplicate of something. I'm sort of reminded of a ridiculous high school story many years ago. I had a classmate who went out to get a tattoo and was very intoxicated and decided rather than picking a tattoo that they had on display, he was going to invent his own tattoo design because he didn't want to have some generic tattoo. And so he sits down and carefully sketches out his design and, hours of agony under the tattoo needle, comes to school and shows us his tattoo. And it's the Billabong logo. That's just the way the world is. Like, Primordia probably has 100 Billabong logos in it.
Oh.
And you just gotta accept it's gonna happen.
That's just great. I mean, but it's of course it's gonna happen. Our brains are relatively human. I mean, like they're biologically similar. So if you're just gonna try to dream up something out of nowhere, of course it's gonna be something that someone else is also following that same process dreamed up. Like if you're terrified of being unoriginal, which I think is absurd. I understand why people want it. I understand it, but it's really not what the focus should be. The focus should be on being quality. Like originality is a multiplier. I really believe that If your idea is bad, the fact that it's original will make people just shocked. It's just like, how are you this stupid? Like, but
Yes.
if your idea is mediocre, or like your idea is like a 0.03 instead of like one being, a multiple of one being fantastic, or it's like 1.1 or something, and you multiply it by four, it's going to be like, it's still not that great. But if your idea is fantastic, then you can get multiplied to phenomenal extremes by being original. But mostly, you need to be good first. Like there's a saying that Glenn Berger said in Song of the Spider-Man or Song of Spider-Man. I always forget if there's a "the" in there. And he was the writer of that famously train wreck musical that was just an absolute disaster. And he writes this fascinating basically, it's like the Blair Witch Project, but for creative stories. It's like this just found horror document about this creative process. It's really fascinating. And they had this superstar cast of brilliant people, and it didn't work. And one of the things he said was, we forgot that something needs to be good before it can be great. Or rather, I think the line goes, before something can be great, it must first be competent.
Yeah.
And so basically they kept trying to go to the big brilliant idea, and they forgot like just the basic storytelling elements for it, or where they would remove something because it was too expensive or it wasn't working, and then the whole rest of the structure would collapse because of that. And that's really important. You need to focus on making sure your ideas work and that they're good, and then you can worry about their original. But on top of that, even if you're paralyzed by the thought of being unoriginal, the only way to protect yourself is to do your research. How will you know if you're being original or not without finding out what everybody else has been doing?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I also think the fear of or the desire to be original at all costs leads to such ridiculous things like we're going to have elves, but we're going to call them something other than elves.
Yeah.
They're going to be just like elves, but they're going to have, square ears rather than pointy ears. It's just like, on some level, that's wrecking the keyframes, right? That's
Yes.
like, what you've accomplished then is that rather than leveraging all of what the player's mind can fill in for you, you have made it impossible for his mind to do that, so that you're asking him to relearn something only to discover that what he has just spent the time to relearn is a Tolkien pastiche. It's like, that's really disappointing if someone takes that time to do it. And, I've seen that in some games, where it doesn't make any sense to me why you would do it, other than this fear that if I just have elves and dwarves, everyone's going to say it's a copy of Tolkien.
Which
And I think
no
you just have to embrace.
which no one basically, unless you become a mega hit, no one will care about that but you. Once it's a mega hit, the hipsters will be going, "Oh, Tolkien did this before," But that's at that point you can be okay with that because you're a mega hit. Like you shouldn't be spending your creative energies into doing something new with elves if elves work really well for you, because it saves you a phenomenal amount of time because you don't need to world build them. Like you're right, it's the exact opposite of what you should be wanting to do. If elves are working for your story, you should use them and focus on your story or focus on your setting. Whereas if you're trying to build exactly elves and you spend all this time relearning it for no value just by someone saying, "Oh, it's original," except it's not. They're just basically elves. That's really awkward. Like I actually am torn on the way Guild Wars 2 does this, because they intentionally do humans and then no other classic races. They actually killed off like their dwarves so they wouldn't have to deal with them. In the Guild Wars 1, there's dwarves, and like let's just kill them all off because we don't want to do dwarves. We want everything to be unique. And I don't know if that was their actually creative process, but it looked like that to me as a fan. And they have elves. They just have elves. But they're interesting elves because they're different in one specific way that I think actually might be better. In which is they're basically forest people who are wise and in tune with nature and so on. But they're actual living plants. They're plants that have grown into this humanoid shape that nature basically uses to be their agents and their protectors. And that is like, oh, that captures the essence of elves, but it does so in a fresh way that's still familiar. It's not like, oh, they're square ears, or, oh, they're elves, but they live underground, but they're still like the exact same thing. Actually, that second idea sounds kind of interesting, but you get the idea.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that I think well, I mean Guild Wars 2 is sort of a special case. I haven't played it, but I mean it's such a beautiful game that I feel like they can get away with a lot too, which is just which is sort of the whole competence before brilliance thing, which is if something is really well done, um, that alone is going to get you much of the way, and maybe all of the way, without having to have something splashier. The other thing I would say is, you know, when you're using a setting that people are familiar with, then it's like you're teaching an upper level course at a university.
Mm.
And almost everyone agrees that these upper level courses are more rewarding for the professors and the students. No one thinks that, the absolute greatest thing in the world is to take an introductory survey history of Middle Earth. If you're doing a Tolkien pastiche, Tolkien did the work. He did at least did a lot of the work. And so, now what you can do is start from the fact that, when you say an elf, you're not dealing with Keebler elves or Santa's elves. The player knows what to expect. And when you say a dwarf, you're not dealing with a small person or a crazy Nibelung, uh, you know from Wagner or whatever. You have the basics all down, and now when you're creating your story or your setting, you don't need to take the time to reintroduce those basic concepts. You can take the basic concepts and really push them to say, how would they work in this more extreme environment? Um, I'm not like a huge uh, Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss fan, although like many people, their books were sort of an entry point for me into fantasy literature. But they did this series called Deathgate, which sort of peters out. But early on, that's basically what they do is they take the established Tolkien races and Tolkien premises, and then they introduce these totally crazy twists, like we're going to have the Tolkien races on a world that consists of islands floating in the sky, and there's a limited supply of water, and at the base of the world are dwarves running a machine that keeps the islands from falling out of the sky, or whatever. I can't remember the details of it. But that's sort of what I'm talking about, is that they don't have to take any time to explain to you why elves would be condescending to humans or why dwarves would be good at machines, because by this point Dungeons and Dragons and Lord of the Rings has done all of that work, and they're able to explore these other concepts. And I think that's something again that, like, if you're creating your own setting, you might want to think about the upsides of incorporating these familiar elements that then let you focus the player's learning on the few unfamiliar elements that you want to introduce. And you'll really be able to capture the player's attention because those will stand out. Whereas if you're saying, you're throwing the player into a setting where he doesn't know anything, he doesn't really know what he has to focus on. I recently tried playing a game called Pillars of Eternity, which I gather is a good game. My computer couldn't really run it, but I played about 40 minutes of it, and it was just an endless list of setting details that were unfamiliar, and I couldn't figure out, do I have to actually remember all these fake Welsh names for things, or are these just elves and dwarves, and I could actually be focusing on this other thing that you want me to learn about. And so I do think that sort of limited element of the unfamiliar is a way of focusing the player.
Yes, that's actually one of the things. There's so many things I could say about that. One of the things is just that our brains love to learn new things and to explore new things, but only once they feel safe and once they feel like they understand and something is familiar. Our brains seek comfort and familiarity first because that's our bedrock of safety. And then we want to start trying new things. So starting with a well-understood existing thing is a psychologically very appealing idea. Another thing is that there's a lot that goes on in a world. And if you try to change literally everything, you're not going to be able to get the player to a point where they can understand why things matter in the world or who cares about what very quickly, or what the options you can do to take a certain action are, or you have to get so many things established. So if you can, that's one of the things that genre works so well. You say Tolkien-esque medieval fantasy. People say, "Oh, I get it. We travel by horse. There's, we can travel by ship. We can't teleport places. There's some big, scary mythical monsters, but they're mostly in the wilds. There's not a dragon running a city. There's all sorts of stuff you can get really, really quickly. And then you can say, actually, there is a dragon running a city, and here's how that works. And they go, oh, that's kind of interesting. And so you get a big canvas of a bedrock to stand on, which was like 3 different metaphors. And then you get to really shape it and add your own twist on it, which is by far the most effective way for any sort of linear narrative, because you're worrying about time. I actually think, for example, one reason Discworld, like if you read The Color of Magic, the entire thing is a travel guide. Like it's just a travel guide. I really feel like Discworld wants to be a campaign setting. Like that's all it wants to be. It just wants to be a big book of here's cool stuff and weird ideas and go nuts, guys. Like, and so it took him,
Yeah.
and it took him a while to actually say, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be writing a story. Like I've read The Color Magic like 3 times, and I think it's amazing every time, and I still don't know what happens in it. Like, and I still just have to keep glossing over stuff and rediscovering stuff because there's too much new. Like when he actually writes Mort, for example, or Guards, those are books that are very standard narratives. They're basically just standard coming of age stories or hero comes to town stories. But because you need that, because the rest of it is so insane. And that's really interesting. I do want to say, though, also that a lot of the most creative and original things come out of these sort of combinations, too. Like, we're not saying, I'm sure, that you would agree with this. I mean, you created a unique setting that you should always go off of like some sort of existing setting and then do a spin on it. But rather, or that there's too many advantages to not do that. But rather, that's a great foundation. And if you're changing something, there needs to be a really good reason why. And if you have really good reasons for that, and the rest of it is familiar, well, that's very helpful. Like you did post-apocalyptic setting with robots. I knew what to expect with a post-apocalyptic setting. You started me in the desert, so that with not many people around, so that I had time to start learning the rules of the world and getting used to it, and only then started introducing new things one at a time. And then we only get into the major city later in the game, after we've already had time to get familiarized with all the rest of the weirdness that serves the basis of the setting. Like Jaws on a spaceship was how they pitched Alien, right? Like they literally, I believe, went to the network and said, we want to do Jaws on a spaceship. And Alien's one of the most interesting and creative things we've seen in a long time in science fiction.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I had not realized that was how it was conceived.
And once you see that, the pattern fits. You're like, oh, they're blue-collar workers it really starts to fit. All the different little quirks of it that make it so unique come off of that very creative model. And so it's really interesting to see how these things are put together. There are some other stuff I would like to talk about that, but then I can do that on my own time for the podcast. So there is one thing that we've already sort of touched on briefly, but I want to go more in depth because it's awesome. You've mentioned about the importance of fitting verbs to the character actions. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think there's sort of three units of interaction that you want to think about. One is, what can the player actually cause the player character to do? The second is, taking the player out of the equation, what things would this character do in a movie, in a book, if you just observed him in real life? And then the third would be, what are the verbs, what are the actions that move the story along, irrespective of the main character? And what you really want is for those 3 sets of verbs to be consistent. In other words, if your character is, and I sort of pick on the game Gemini Rue here whenever I talk about this, but if your character is an ex-mercenary named Asriel Cain, or whatever his name is, something Asriel Odin, right? So the devil of war, god of war, uh, and you wear a trench coat and smoke cigarettes and have a gun. Uh, you really need to let the player shoot whenever he wants to, intimidate people whenever he wants to, and things like that. But when you play the game, like the first puzzle you hit is there's an obnoxious doorman who won't let you into a building. And he's like a 20-year-old annoying pencil-necked geek. And there's nothing you can do to intimidate him or just manhandle him. And I sort of lost any interest in playing the game after that because you can't make me play a character named Asriel Odin in a trench coat and then tell me that I'm just like Roger Wilco in Space Quest or Guybrush Threepwood in Monkey Island. I mean, it's a different character. He should be able to do different things, and the fantasy you're selling the player is that you are this character. And then so that's sort of one point of harmony that you want. And then the other is the one we talked about earlier, which is just, if you make a game, where it's Street Fighter, right? The absurdity of Street Fighter 2's plot, if you actually study the plot of the game, is that they're trying to infiltrate and take down an international terrorist organization. And it's sort of like that has nothing to do with the verbs of the game, right? Which are like strong punch and quick kick. And, it's just totally unrelated. Now, in that game, it's like, whatever, the game is just a sort of fun version of playing Bloodsport or whatever. But in a game where the story mattered, if there was that level of disconnect between what the characters and the player are able to do and what the story calls for, you run into a different problem, which is that you end up having other people be the main engines of action in the story. Whether it's, your boss is the one who's really doing things, or you have some, wish fulfillment character that, Mary Sue, who comes in and does things. And that's really frustrating for the player. It's really frustrating when, it's some other guy who's the hero. When I worked on a game, Kohan 2, Kings of War, there was an NPC, it was a strategy game. There was an NPC character who was like the avatar of the CEO of the company. And he just insisted that character had to be the one who saved the day in the end. But that wasn't the character that you were controlling in the game. And it was just like, it was the biggest downer in the world for players. It's like, you do all this work, and then this random other guy rides in and saves the day. And so I think, in an adventure game, what I would say is like the verbs that the player does are pick up, put together, and search carefully, and talk, and that's basically it. And then you have a set of things that the character basically won't do, which is force his way past someone, or let someone else solve the problem. And so you need to sort of think about what kind of character will behave that way. And you see, in the games that work well, you end up having Space Quest, you have a janitor. A janitor does exactly those sorts of things. And then, Gabriel Knight, you have sort of a down on his luck novelist, bookstore owner, curio collector. And it's not perfect, but that is, again, someone who has this pack rat mentality and is not likely to be sort of a man of action or whatever. And then, sometimes you'll also see it like a fairy tale character, because likewise in fairy tales, the protagonist is always picking up magical items and using them in inappropriate ways and things like that. And so those are sort of characters and settings that really lend themselves to the gameplay. And I think the same is true in a role-playing game, like a P&P role-playing game. You want to make sure that your setting provides a rich canvas for the actions the player will want to do. It's a little different because in a role-playing game, you can let the player say he wants to do anything. So you don't have the same problem of like, you're making him role play an Azrael Odin, but you're not giving him a shoot verb.
Oh, you have the
But I
same
think,
problem. It's just that if he takes it's just that he can click that shoot verb and then the game crashes. It,
yeah, that's right.
yeah, you do just derail the whole thing. Like that's one thing I talk about a lot. You need to make sure the situation doesn't give. Like I say that derailing is like any other crime. You need motive and opportunity.
Yeah.
Which as a prosecutor, I'm sure again you can appreciate. But also the thing going on here, which I think is really worthwhile talking about in verbs, something I have not talked about in this podcast before, is choosing a system, a role-playing system that provides the verbs that fit the story and setting you want to tell. Now, one of the things that was actually a weakness in Raven Shadow when I was working on it was you were kind of supposed to play Raven Shadow like an adventure game for the most part. You were supposed to not really fight to solve your problems. Everybody was basically stronger than you. You were supposed to be tiptoeing around the shoulders of these colossal, terrifying figures and monsters. And you did fight, but you fought for survival and to escape more often than you actually... You didn't see a problem, and you were just saying, all right, there's a giant encampment of soldiers, of 30 people who are professional military. We're 4 guys and a wolf. Let's take them. You didn't solve your problem that way. Like if something was in your way, you didn't just try to hack your way through it. That would get you killed. That was very clearly expressed. And near the end of the campaign, I started running into some problems. I actually had been introducing some encounters that I expected players to fight, but they didn't actually want to do that because they were so terrified of the setting at that point, and they wanted to always take the safer option because they were aware it was a permadeath campaign and all sorts of things. And they were worried that people were always going to be stronger than them, which honestly was a very reasonable approach. And they treated things more logically. Just because I thought it might be fun to mix things up with combat, they were in their characters' heads, and they were like, we don't want to risk our lives fighting these people if we don't have to. But the thing was, the system that we were running was a system that I had built, because I just thought, hey, let's just run the system for this game. And it has a lot of combat powers. It's unlike most systems, it's evenly split between utility and combat, but people had built these combat powers and they had leveled up and they had chosen new combat powers, and that's a verb. And it's like I never get to throw a fireball. I never get to show off this thing. And so often when I've been running role-playing settings, and I've often thought players just like, oh, come on, we want to talk about the story. Let's focus on the story. You say you like my game because of the story. I started realizing that if the system provides cool combat powers and spells and magic swords and fireballs, players are going to want to press those buttons. And that, I think, lines directly up with what you're saying, just in reverse.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
The creator of Gunpoint also talked about that he came up with the name Gunpoint for his game, and so the player, of course, had to have a gun. It's about basically infiltrating these facilities. And he realized that the most fun parts of the game were how you cleverly wire objects together to create these improvised traps, and that solving your problem with a gun was too straightforward. So we started introducing punishments for the gun and all sorts of things like that. And I realized at the end that he should basically just cut the gun. But at that point it was too late, and he just thought if my game wasn't called Gunpoint, maybe I would have actually cut that gun earlier. Because whenever somebody actually pushed the trigger on the gun, the game got less fun. My final question would be, for now at least, maybe we'll do this again sometime, is what is a piece of advice that you wish you had known when you were starting out, and not one that you hear someone say all the time?
I mean, I think a lot of people do say this, but I still think it's worth saying again, which is just start small. I spent 13 years or so trying to make games and never finishing one, other than maybe like some random, like quick basic games I programmed. And essentially got in the habit of not finishing my projects. And then eventually managed to get in the habit of finishing them. And, habits really matter a lot. And big projects are really, really difficult. The first part of a project is always much more fun than the last part of a project. Or maybe the last part's pretty fun, but there's a hump in the middle of total misery. On every project, everything I've ever worked on, whether it's a legal brief or a video game or a novel or anything. And I think if you just try to do a really big project, what inevitably will happen when you're starting out is you'll get to that hump and you'll look back and you'll realize everything I've done is crap. You know, I could do something twice as good if I started again. And incidentally, I have this really neat idea. Why don't I just start again? And then you'll get to the hump and you'll look back and everything will be crap because along the way you will have improved as a writer and a designer. And you can get stuck in this habit of never finishing anything. The thing is, if you finish things, people will like them. Even if it's only 5 people who like them, you'll be surprised. Like people will play them and read them and so on. And what you'll end up with if you have a body of finished work are opportunities to make bigger projects, with the support of other people. And where you are if you've spent 15 years with false starts is no one is going to think that you're someone who's going to finish a project, no matter how great you've gotten along the way. And you yourself aren't going to expect that you're going to finish a project. So I do think, you know, whether in P&P terms this is like start with a module rather than with a setting or something. I'm not sure quite what the analogy is, but I think, for example, a lot of people in computer games like to start out with a role-playing game, and those are really, really cumbersome to make, and essentially impossible. I would say start with something small. We thought Primordia was going to be a 3-month project, and it was a 2.5-year project. So, expect everything will take much longer and aim for something that you think you can get done. And it'll be better to get it done and move on to the next thing than to stop halfway through.
Yeah, the rule is that everything in game development always takes longer than you expect, even once you account for this rule.
That's right.
So there's a lot of reasons for that. There's actually some really great ways you can get more accurate estimations, mostly by just looking at how long similar projects took. And you'll be like, whoa, that took like 3 years? No, I can do it faster. No, you can't. Like, that's how long it's
Yeah.
going to take. You then adjust based on your own experience in the industry and your experience as a writer and so on. But you don't adjust by a factor of 10. You adjust by like a 10% change. But yeah, starting small, one of the best ways to do it is to, and I actually, when I did my first like overview of setting creation, I said like, basically create the tourism guide for your world, then focus entirely on just building the place for your first adventure. Because as long as you understand the larger rules of your world, that's fine. But now focus on building what the player is going to be seeing in that moment. The way that a game only renders the environment within the player's line of sight while they're seeing it. And then between the weeks, you can build the next adventure and the next adventure, the next adventure. That's something that is a luxury when you're working on as an RPG. You can afford to build more of a Telltale Games model where you are only building stuff as people are starting to get to it, which is very useful. My major advice on that point would be to set yourself a deadline when you're going to start, or when you're going to publish whatever you're doing or whatever, or when you're going to show it to people, when you're going to read it to people, whatever the thing is, playtest, and schedule that playtest. Like schedule it from like 2 weeks from now and start working. You'll be amazed at how much more likely you are to finish something when you're going to have to go to somebody and say, I don't actually have anything.
Yeah, I think that's great advice.
And also, you give yourself 2 weeks or just even a weekend. And if you think, oh, I could do all this in a weekend, great, do it in a weekend. And you'll start to get a much better appreciation of your actual skills. And if you're able to do all that in a weekend, fantastic. But yeah, schedule the playtest first. All right, Mark, it has been phenomenal having you over. Thanks for staying up late for me. And it was great to have you.
Well, thank you very much. It was a lot of fun, and I hope we get to talk more.
Yeah, me too. All right, I'm going to go play some more Primordia. See you later, man.
All right. Bye.
Bye.